When you think of a mono red deck, what's the first archetype that comes to mind? For me, it's aggro stuff like my $100 goblin deck. Also, dragons. So, what would happen if you could play dragons and dinosaurs and gods as if they were goblins? What would happen if some of the most overcosted cards in the game only cost 3 mana? Tanuk Steadfast Second is a new legendary creature card from the most recent Edge of Eternities set. As a commander, he introduces warp to every creature and artifact in your hand. You can cast these cards for 3 mana, but they leave the battlefield at the end of your turn. You can always cast them for their full cost on a later turn, however, that doesn't help your board state. This may sound like a negative, but what if we jam the deck full with cards that only care about entering the battlefield? In that case, suddenly we aren't too worried about whether or not they'll stick around. In fact, in some cases, we'll hope they don't. Now let's talk about some ramp. Thanks to Tanuk's ability being an alternative casting cost reducers are particularly destructive in this deck. One of the biggest differences between Tanuk and commanders like him is that you're casting cards with a Kavu legend. Ruby Medallion and Hazaret's Monument reduce the cost of Tanuk's warp ability. Then you can double dip on the cost reduction when you cast cards again from exile. There are also commander staples like Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, and sure, Fire Diamond falls into that category too. And there's Iron Mirror, Mind Stone, and Ornithopter of Paradise in that 2 mana slot as well. However, towards the top of my ramp curve is stuff like Thran Dynamo. I pulled a Thran Dynamo a while back and hadn't found a great fit for it with my current deck roster. This one solves that problem. Hedron Archive is another great piece that also serves as some emergency card draw. My greatest weakness. Now, I like to include one planeswalker in each of my decks. Call it a calling card, call it stupid. It's something I enjoy doing if there's a good fit. Like Liliana Dreadhorde General and Mono Black, Chandra Torch of Defiance does a little bit of everything in this deck. She can +1 for some impulse draw that also burns Dragonhawk anyone, or she can +1 for 2 red mana. You can -3 her to snipe some value creature, or you can ult to create a generic Dragon Tempest. She hits on basically every kind of utility. At the toppity top of my ramp curve, Coveted Jewel is more of a draw 3 for 3, which is an insane rate for red, but it does technically ramp. Not sure I'm ever recasting this spell after the initial warp in, but it's worth mentioning. The final ramp spell to mention in my deck is a weird one. Elena Kessig Trapper. Tanuk on 4 into Elena on 5 is pretty great. Tanuk gives Elena haste, so you can tap her for that mana ability immediately for 4 mana, slamming down something else with warp. I wasn't a big fan of rituals in this deck, it's a personal choice I guess, but the consistent pop-offs Elena provides makes her a pretty sweet inclusion. My goal with this section was to set up for an explosive turn 6. With at least 11 ramp spells in the deck, there are a few extras I didn't mention because they're a bit more conditional. I have a 75% chance of playing out ramp before I want Tanuk on the battlefield on turn 5. This way, I can hopefully cast a spell for warp the turn Tanuk comes down, and double warp for 14 mana's worth the turn after. My favorite part of each deck, outside of mono red. I tried to add some unique options here that focus on quantity and randomness, and ultimately, I think this category actually turned out to be surprisingly fun, where it might usually be a bit frustrating in red, especially since there are over 20 cards in here that kinda draw you cards. These 2 sorceries were the most common mono-red staples. Both give you nice card selection, but they run into the issue of being a bit useless if your hand is empty. Regardless, you can't pass up on cards like Faithless Looting and Cathartic Reunion to fill out card draw options. One of the cooler cards I found thanks to this article on EDHREC, which I linked in the description, was Party Thrasher. It's a new card from Modern Horizons 3 that consistently does a lot for 2 mana. Not only does it make Tanuk into a mana dork for your cards in exile, since you're not swinging with him for damage ever, it also gives you a weird rummage or impulse draw on your first main phase. My 3 slot was filled with all kinds of fun stuff, the first being one of my favorites, Raz's Tunnel Grinder. This is a card I tried to make fit in my Ravaz deck until I cut basically every single 3-drop. You can watch that video after, I'll link it at the end. Rummage abilities like this that give you +1 cards on your discard are great, and the fact that Tunnel Grinder eventually turns into a ramping Discover option is great foreshadowing for the back half of this section. Embrace the Unknown and Into the Fire aren't too special, but with Retrace on the former and Modality on the latter, I'm a huge fan of their versatility. Seize the Spotlight is a nasty dilemma. You either steal up to 3 creatures or draw 3 cards and make 3 treasures. Something tells me you're usually getting the latter here, which is a fantastic rate for 3 mana in red. While many might consider Professional Facebreaker a staple, I don't play it in any of my decks. I actually don't own any copies of this card, and I never have. But I wanted this deck to feel consistent in the utility package to support how random it plays out in the late game. Now, to go completely against what I just said about consistency, Fiery Gambit caught my eye and I felt obligated to include it. At its worst, you completely whiff and beg the table to be nice to you since you wasted 3 mana. If you hit 3 in a row, well, you just got lucky and can't be blamed for what's about to happen next. At the top end of my draw, Clive Ifrit's Dominant seems to be the latest staple in big red decks. Between Tanuk and Clive, he's a draw 4, but you'll often have a few extra red pips on the board. If you've got 9 mana sitting around, you can warp Clive and immediately flip him into Ifrit, Warden of Inferno, a 9/9 removal ramp demon. Bustable Gear Hulk is an inexpensive card that gives great value with warp, and not the Walmart kind. Again, you're putting an opponent between a rock and a hard place because they won't want to give you cards, but they also know this deck is jammed full of stuff that could easily kill them from 20 health. And for maximum drawing power, I added 2 wheelers, Dragon Mage and Nullspine Dragon. Yes, Dragon Mage can help your opponents, and Nullspine can whiff a bit, but this deck plays on the edge of eternities. I think it's time to unveil my trap card in this deck. If you're unfamiliar with the widely beloved fan favorite mechanic Cascade, let me explain how it works. Maelstrom Colossus is an 8 mana common, meaning it's basically unplayable. Because Cascade only triggers when something is cast, you can't cheat it from the graveyard, so it's in a tricky spot. With Tanuk's ability, Maelstrom Colossus can be cast for 3 mana, but Cascade looks at the mana value of the card, not how much you paid for it. This is basically the entire reason I included Ingenuity Engine, Boarding Party, Aurora Phoenix, and Noise Marine. A couple of these have other abilities, but I really wanted them for that Cascade trigger. That's not the end of my cheating antics. Industrial Advancement is a more conditional version of Cascade, but since Warp will send stuff to exile at the end of your turn, you may as well sacrifice them for value instead. Ilharg the Raise board just places a creature onto your board attacking alongside it. With all the ETB stuff in here, that's a big problem. Not for you though. Finally, Trumpeting Carnosaur is a bit more specific with Discover 5, but it's cheating stuff out regardless. Or it's a worse Lightning Bolt for extra removal help. This archetype, commonly known as Sneak Attack, isn't a new one. In 2020, Purphoros Bronze-Blooded was printed for the first and only time. You can see the resemblance between Tanuk and Purphoros, however, the key difference is in the fine print of their 3-cost abilities. While Tanuk allows you to cast creatures using Warp, Purphoros simply allows you to place them on the battlefield. This is useful to bypass counterspells, but Tanuk also gives you access to a wider card pool due to artifacts not having to be creatures, unlike Purphoros. Ultimately, they're 2 sides of the same coin, but that last part, about artifacts having warp, truly sets this deck apart from its predecessors. Now let's chat through what's going to kill your opponent's stuff in this deck. Most of the removal in this deck is baked into the top end. I'm not trying to make too many enemies before my board is set up, but I do have Vandal Blast, Abrade, and Chaos Warp in here for mostly instant speed interaction. Terminal Velocity is a new card from Edge of Eternities that functions as a board wipe. There's plenty of good cards you can throw on the board and some not so good ones, but for the most part, it's pretty easy to reset the board with this card. There's a couple more board wipes in here. Since this is the deck that wants to play for late, having a reset button you can hit before hitting the afterburners is definitely a need. Cards like Duplicant, Meteor Golem, and Spine of Ishsa give me spot removal for specific threats that need to be dealt with. For the most part though, the removal in this deck is attached to big creatures that can spread out damage in a variety of ways. The best removal in red is player removal, so Drakaseth blasting each player for a combined 10 damage is pretty on point. Boggart and Hellkite has 5 damage that can be sent at 5 targets or all at 1, and Spawn of Thraxus shoots the interplanetary missile at a specific target, usually an opponent who's got around 10 life left. Now it's not exactly removal, but stealing stuff kinda counts. Atali Primal Storm is a Dino classic who can nab a kill spell off the top of your opponent's deck, or just about anything else. You never really know what you're gonna get, but you're definitely getting something. And one of my favorite cards in this deck is Molten Primordial, particularly because you can snag 3 commanders and throw them at separate players to have your opponents remove each other's stuff. Yeah, that's pretty cool for you. I feel that this is a good time to mention that while we're talking about removal, it's important to prevent your own stuff from getting stolen or Tanuk getting blown up. so I wanted to run a decent amount of protection in this deck. There are the obvious permanents, Lightning Greaves, and the budget version Swiftfoot Boots, but recently Wizards has printed a couple fantastic instants that allow you to redirect spells. Untimely Malfunction is a modal spell I'd usually want to use for protection, while Return the Favor offers a bit more flexibility with that copy ability. Of course, we've got the OG itself, Bolt Bend, as the premium redirection spell. There are a handful of random cards in this deck that may fall under the categories I've just finished discussing, but I wanted to outline them as a specific synergy package within the deck. These cards are a bit more specific to what you're doing with Warp and interact with the mechanic in kind of fun ways. Starting first with Erratic Portal. This can serve as a protection spell or a way to buy back the ability on a card you're warping in so you can do it again, like Cascade or Juicy Removal. It's 5 mana to ultimately make your board state worse, but it's a fun inclusion if you're okay with a slower game. Flaming Tyrannosaurus rewards you with a lightning bolt whenever you cast a spell from exile, pumping itself until an extinction event turns it into a barrage of nuclear missiles. Golden Argosy is some truly unfair magic in this deck. Cast a card with Warp, use it to crew Golden Argosy and blink that creature back onto the battlefield for a second round of its ETB, and you get to keep it on the battlefield. It's no longer going to exile. Pretty sweet way to double up on ETB triggers while removing the downside of Warp. If your cards do find themselves exiled in the Warp, Wild Magic Sorcerer gives them all Cascade. Yeah. Skitterbeam Battalion and Threefold Thunderhulk help build up your board a bit with some chump blockers, since you'll likely be perceived as a threat and have multiple opponents swinging at you each turn. And Wondrous Crucible does several things. It's a bit of a protection piece with Ward 2, a mill engine in case that ever matters, and a recursion piece. Having a way to snag things from your graveyard each turn feels like a pretty sweet payoff for 7 mana. The final card I want to mention from this section is possibly my favorite card in the whole deck. Worldgorger Dragon. If you're unfamiliar with this card, you may be asking, does that do what I think it does? The answer is yes. It exiles every single permanent you control. That may seem counterintuitive, to which I would also say, yes. Having lands is good. However, if you have even a slight board presence and can warp in Worldgorger Dragon, it can cascade, the verb, not the mechanic, into multiple incredible ETB retriggers. If you've gotten to the point where there's a wealth of mana on the board, you could potentially warp in several creatures before Worldgorger, then use it to blink them back, kind of like Golden Argosy, retriggering their abilities, and again, removing the condition that they go to exile on your end step. It's incredibly risky, but this deck requires that you play on the edge of eternities.